Let's pick up where we left off in the last lecture after hearing the Norse story of East of the Sun, West of the Moon. Now, if you were listening closely, you may have realized that the story contained versions of two different tale types. Did you recognize them? Sleeping Beauty, which we learned about earlier, and the classic tale Beauty and the Beast, which we'll hear more about here today. And one of my favorite images in that story is when the girl sinks her fingers into the bear's thick, white fur. It's a wonderful image, but it's terrifying because she's going off to marry this creature. Ugh. But the creature isn't all he seems to be, is he? And the girl grows to be a lot braver than she ever thinks she could be. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about transformation and bravery. Now let's talk for a moment about transformation first. The story of Beauty and the Beast is part of a collection of stories in classic folklore called the Animal Bridegroom Cycle, in which the hero or the heroine is faced with the awful idea of marrying an animal or a monster. Can you imagine being asked to marry a bear, or, as we'll hear about in a future lecture, to marry a frog, or in another one, a mole? Ooh. But he's not really a bear, is he? Beauty and the Beast is all about transformations and tricks of the eye. We think we know what we're looking at, but actually we have no idea what's underneath that fur, or what the girl in rags will become in the end. Through the magic of transformation, stories give us a way to make our hidden nature, what we're like on the inside, our character, to make that visible as our outside nature. And they reveal how our outer nature can cloak a much more menacing inner nature. Our culture teaches us that people who look a certain way are normal, and people who look another way are weird. And someone who looks a certain way is safe, or someone who looks another way is dangerous. But in these stories, as in life, someone who looks nice may not actually be nice. A wolf in sheep's clothing, as the folkloric phrase goes. And sometimes, someone who looks menacing, like the beast, well, he may not be that beastly after all. At its core, stories like this one make us look at the world around us and the people in our world differently. The stories make us question, what's really real about the world around me? Can I trust in appearances? Should I try to make myself look nice? And how do I do that? What does nice look like in different situations? How do I figure out friend from foe? From mean girls in school to sociopaths, people who look nice may not be what they seem. Whom can I really trust? These are all really important questions for us to ask at any age. Now here's Dr. Gila Kiyum to tell us a little more about the art of transformation in fairy tales and in everyday life.
So if we look at how stories start, they begin in hardship. Something's gone wrong. There has been death, there's been loss, there's illness. And the challenge for the protagonist is, how do they then deal with these challenges and difficulties, even when they don't want to? So stories model for us that hope and resilience is what keeps people alive, and is not avoidance or paralysis. So depending on what transition we are going through, stories will create this wonderful place where we can explore what that means. And at the end of it, you have this dynamic form of identity creation that the protagonist or the hero is so much more enriched in terms of wisdom and experience, and more sophisticated in terms of their character formation than how they started off at the start of the story. So whether it's a transition from childhood into adulthood, which is what a lot of our fairy tales are based on, whether it is the rite of passage for some greater journey, these transitions can be worked through again in the safe space of a fairy tale. So there's symbolisms in stories, and also a distant place that is still relatable. And the symbols can be something that means something to us that we hold on to. And using them, we can access our inner self, our inner conflict. But one thing that children have a hard time doing, and we as adults too, is we don't really want to be talking about ourselves and our problems. So it's really nice to make it about other people, but we really don't want to do that. And yet fairy tales and stories create this wonderful place where you can actually talk about your problems without talking about your problems. You can talk about your anxiety and your fears without appearing weak or vulnerable. It's the character that's feeling weak and vulnerable, but we can live it with them and identify for the moment. And then when we're feeling stronger and more competent, just like that character, we can come back, and yet we can bring that lesson learned, the strength that we've experienced in that storytelling, and use it.
In other versions of Beauty and the Beast transforms into the shape of other animals. He's not always this warm and furry mammal. Now see if you can tell the kind of beast he turns into in this version of the story, which is the classic French story recorded in 1756 by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Montbant. How brave would you have to be to face this beast? Also, perk your ears up to the behavior of the sisters in this story. They may appear pretty on the outside, but what kind of creature would you imagine them to be underneath? What do they transform into in the end? Now, de Beaumont's story has as its source a text that is over 100 pages long. Let's hear a shorter form of this French version of Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, a rich merchant had 3 daughters and 3 sons, and of all of them, the youngest was the most beautiful. Not only outwardly, but in her character, too. Her sisters were selfish, that is mine, and proud, oh, look at me, and spent most of their time at parties, la 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 la, and turning away suitors because they were not good enough for them. But Beauty, oh, Beauty, she was humble and kind. And she read books. Oh, have you read this one? And she told her suitors that she was too young to marry. Over time, the family lost its fortune, and they were forced to live out in the country. Now, this may sound good to us nowadays, but at that time, it meant that the family moved away from the royal court and from the parties and from the suitors. And the 2 older sisters were miserable. But Beauty, who was ever patient, she woke at 4 a.m. Now to work. And she cleaned the house and made the meals and never complained of keeping her father and her family as comfortable as possible. And one day, their father went to meet a ship on which he was supposed to have many goods coming in. His ship had come in. The 2 older, greedy sisters imagined the riches that they would once again have, and they asked their father to buy us dresses and ribbons. Beauty didn't really want anything. But because she didn't want her sisters to look as selfish as they really were, she asked for a rose. But when the father met the ship, other people took the goods. And on his return to the cottage home, he got lost in the woods and in the snow, and he was chased by wolves. And finally, he saw a palace, a light in the middle of the storm. Well, he raced to the palace, but he didn't find anyone inside. Hello? And seeing a warm fire, oh, he warmed himself. He was starving, and he saw a table filled with food. And he ate some of the chicken that was laid out, and he called out a "thank you" to the invisible fairy who must have led him to this place, and again "thanked her" when he was led to a room where he could sleep. And when he awoke, he found clean clothes and hot chocolate laid out for him. He dressed and drank the hot chocolate, and as he was leaving, he passed by an enchanted garden, which was magically alive in the midst of winter. And he remembered his beauty and her simple request. and he went to take a branch of roses. But no sooner had he torn the branch than a terrible beast appeared. And the beast told him, "How ungrateful you have been to steal my prized roses after I have cared so well for you." And when the beast learned that the man had daughters, well, the beast ordered the man to return with one of them. Well, the father returned home. And he couldn't eat. He was so heartsick. He couldn't ask one of his daughters to go and be with that beast. The two older sisters asked what they could do for him. But when he told them what had happened, both of them replied, "Ugh, no, we will not go to that beast's palace in your place." But Beauty, she said, "I will go, Papa." And her two sisters took onions and rubbed them into their eyes to make themselves shed tears. "Oh, we are so sorry you are leaving." The father went with Beauty to the palace, and then out came the beast. Now, what do you imagine the beast looked like in this story? Now, most of us picture a large, hairy animal, but the truth is, in the classic text by Beaumont, the beast was described as a hissing creature. The monster made himself heard, a frightful noise caused by the enormous weight of his body, the terrible clank of his scales, and an awful roaring announced his arrival. Terror took possession of Beauty. The old man, embracing his daughter, uttered piercing cries, it says. The father unwillingly left, and Beauty willingly stayed. And the poor beast admitted to Beauty that he is, in fact, in his own words, ugly, and that he has no wit. Now, appearance and wit were two things that were crucially important at court in the 18th century in France. At that time, men wore powdered curly wigs and high-heeled shoes at court to make themselves look attractive. And if you didn't have the right joke or the humorous thing to say, you were laughed out of the royal court. It was a very unforgiving and bullying atmosphere. But even though he is beastly and scaly, and has no wit, Beauty sees that he is in fact kind. And he makes her mistress of the castle. And everything that she wants she can have, though she asks for very little. And when the beast asks, "Beauty, will you marry me?" what do you think she says? "No, beast, I will not marry you." And after several weeks, he allowed her to return home for a visit, but her jealous sisters made her stay longer than she promised, and she dreams one night of the beast dying in the courtyard of his palace. Oh no! She awakened, put on an enchanted ring from her bedside, and was taken back to the beast's palace. And she called for him, "Beast!" And remembering her dream, she searched for him in the courtyard, and there he was, half-starved and dying. And she said, and here I want to read to you again from de Beaumont's classic text, "No, dear beast, you must not die. Live to be my husband. The grief I now feel convinces me that I cannot live without you." And the text continues, "Beauty scarce had pronounced these words when she saw the palace sparkle with light and fireworks, instruments of music. She turned to her dear beast, but how great was her surprise. Beast was disappeared, and she saw at her feet one of the loveliest princes that I ever beheld. Though this prince was worthy of all her attention, she could not help asking where Beast was. You see him at your feet, said the prince. A wicked fairy had condemned me to remain under that shape until a beautiful girl should consent to marry me. There was only you in the world generous enough to be won by the goodness of my temper. And you know the rest. He offered her the crown, and she became queen. And whatever happened to Beauty's mean sisters? Well, a good fairy took the two wicked sisters, and she turned them into statues. The spell to be broken only when they saw the error of their cruel ways, which the fairy feared would be never. What do you think of the beast in that story? And don't you love the ending of that story? The evil characters are all turned into stone. In another version of this story from Germany, called Beauty's Stone Sisters, the sisters meet a similar end. Now pay attention in this story to the scary form of the beast and to the bravery of the girl, and again, how the sisters transform in the very end of the story. This version is by collector Ludwig Bechstein, and he was a contemporary of the Grimms, and a more famous one at that. His version, from 1847, well, it begins with the classic story, except that the youngest daughter, Nietchen, has a little friend who is poor, who is called Little Broomstick. Now, in this story of Little Broomstick, the merchant winds up in the home of the beast, and the beast is enormous, with a long, ugly snout and ears that hang down and a shaggy coat and tail that appeared before him, and he laid his sharp claws on the man's shoulder. Now, the beast in this story tells the merchant he must bring back his youngest daughter, Nietchen, but the merchant, he waits, and he waits. And then finally, he takes Little Broomstick to the beast, but the beast takes Little Broomstick and pops her, whoop, into an enchanted carriage and sends her back and carries Nietchen home to him. And each night, the beast comes to rest and nuzzle by her bed, and she gradually comes to snuggle up with him and feel sorry for him. And then one night, when he does not come home, she searches for him, and she finds him dying. And she weeps for him, and her falling tears break the spell. And then he explains that his father wanted him to marry a woman who he didn't love. And when the beast refused, well, the father sent a sorceress to turn that prince into a monster until a beautiful girl, a young girl, would love him in spite of his ugliness and shed tears for him. And at this, they are married. But she must remain in the castle for a year, and through this enchanted mirror, she watches her father and her sisters. And as the months pass, her father begins to grow sicker and sicker, while the sisters, they keep entertaining their friends with parties. And when the year is out, the beast gives her this magical set of herbs, and Nietchen brings these herbs to her father, and the herbs bring her father back to health. And Nietchen is so happy, she invites her sisters to visit her. But when the sisters see Nietchen's happiness and the fine palace where Nietchen lives, they're so filled with jealousy that they kill Nietchen. But at that very moment, a fairy, the same one who had enchanted the beast, the fairy appears, and she brings Nietchen back to life. And the fairy says that the sisters must be punished. Now, Nietchen protests, but the fairy turns the girls into two stone pillars. And the fairy says that the pillars, they would remain until a man would fall in love with them. And the columns, as the story goes, to this day are standing in the gardens of that splendid castle. For, as the story goes, it has not yet occurred to any man that he should fall in love with cold, heartless stones. And Nietchen and her husband, her father, and Little Broomstick all lived happily ever after. Now, which version of the beast is scarier to you? The white bear in East of the Sun, West of the Moon? Or the snake-like beast in the French Beauty and the Beast? Or this German beast in Beauty's Stone Sisters with his long snout and droopy ears? He seems like this enormous dog-bear pig. Often what we think of as beastly looks or behavior, that's culturally specific, meaning our culture around us decides what looks appealing or unappealing, beastly from beautiful. What is unattractive in one culture may be beautiful in another. Now, we'll come back to this idea of cultural beauty in folk and fairy tales later in the course. Right now, consider, how brave would you have to be to go off with a scaly, snake-like monster or a shaggy dog-bear pig? Remember how everyone kept asking the girl in East of the Sun, West of the Moon, "Are you afraid?" The bear, the three older women, the four winds, they all ask her, "Are you afraid?" Do you think the girl really was afraid when the bear and the winds asked her if she was afraid? And she said, "No." Have you ever felt afraid, but you were brave anyway? Being brave doesn't necessarily mean being fearless. Being brave means you face your fear. Fear is often inherent in bravery. Without it, bravery doesn't exist. It's okay to be afraid. Bravery means that we don't let our fears make our decisions for us. And in these stories, the girl faces her fears again and again, and that's life. We are constantly facing our own recurring fears throughout our lives. First, the girls face their fear of heading off with the beast, be he scaly or snake-like or hairy and huge. But they do it with different faces of bravery. In the French Beauty and the Beast, we are meant to think the best of Beauty. Unlike her sisters, Beauty seems almost impossibly perfect, and even so does the father. In East of the Sun, the girl refuses to go for a week. Even then, we really don't believe her when she says that she's not afraid. And then, after the girls go off with the creatures, they see into the deeper nature behind the creature. They fall for the beast. And in the French and Norse versions, then they face a deeper fear, the fear of losing the one they love. And that's a deep, deep fear, to lose the people around us whom we love. In the Norse story we heard earlier, the girl wakes up in the middle of that clearing alone, and she weeps for what could have been. At some point in our lives, we are all in that clearing, or draped over a dying loved one. Oh, what could have been. And we have a choice in that clearing. We can let our fear and grief consume us, and sometimes that's just what we do. We cry till we can cry no more, as the story goes. But the Norse story shows us we can face that fear and get up and go and get our prince, which is what's so great about hearing different versions of these stories. While the German and the French versions play up the romance, love being the literal force that rescues the prince from his beastly curse, I love that in the Norse version, it's not only love that she feels, but love spurs her to action. In the face of her fears, the gumption to get up there and get out and find him. Now that is bravery. And the girl has help. In East of the Sun, the girl sets out and encounters 3 old women who play the traditional role of magical helpers, characters who help the hero or heroine in their journey. And they each say to the girl, "Perhaps you are the one who should have been with the prince." Now, there are times in life when you will wonder what should have been, as if our stories are foretold in some fairy tale plot line, and we feel like our lived story has gone astray. That's what the role of the magical helper is there for. We're not happy with how our story is going. And sometimes outside forces, like a good friend or a parent, well, they're not content to let that story of ours go on in an unhappy way. So with their help, we find the courage or whatever it is we need in order to alter our storyline. The truth is, there isn't one path that our story should take. There are many from which to choose. There are guiding forces that offer us help, that open doors to more choices. The old woman who gives the heroine the apple, the wind who takes her to the troll's castle. But we have to make the choice to take that help, to go to the castle, to win back the prince. And sometimes we don't get the prince in the end. Sometimes he marries the troll, and there we are. Sometimes we marry the troll, and then we're really in a pickle. Oh, what should have been. Should can cripple our lives, or it can move us to new choices. We get the idea of how a story should go from lots of different sources, from the example set by our parents and our friends, and from fairy tales. Sometimes we map out how the story of our life should go. And when we can't forgive others for choices that slam up against the way that we think things should have gone for us, well, we lose agency and power in the story of our own lives. When we can't forgive ourselves for the choices we made that veer us from that story that should have been, well, it's hard to move forward into what our story will now be. One of the important roles of the helper in stories like this one, the old woman at the cliff, is to say, I forgive you. Your story forgives you. Now get up and go find your prince. In fairy tales, as often in life, it's rarely too late to turn the story around. And in this case, it's not too late. Rather, it's a challenge to the heroine, a challenge which she meets. Her prince is restored to her because of her perseverance and her bravery and her cleverness. And in all of these versions of the story of Beauty and the Beast, the Norse, east of the sun, west of the moon, the French version of Beauty and the Beast, or the German Beauty Stone Sisters, it's the beast who gets transformed back into a human. And the girl's bravery and inner strength of will and character make the magical transformation happen. Has there ever been a time when your bravery has transformed the situation you found yourself in? East of the Sun, West of the Moon has many similarities to a much older story, the Greek story of Cupid and Psyche. And in this last story for today, look at the many similarities between the Norse story and this Greek myth. How does the heroine's curiosity get her into trouble? Twice. A king and a queen had 3 beautiful daughters, but of all of them, Psyche, she was the most beautiful. But she was so beautiful, the goddess Venus, the goddess of love and of beauty, she became jealous. And she told her son, Cupid, the god of of love, to take one of his magical arrows, which makes you fall in love with the first person you see, and to touch that arrow to Psyche, to make her fall in love with a monster. But when Cupid goes to Psyche while she sleeps, he's in awe of her beauty, and instead, he pricks himself with the arrow and falls in love with Psyche, and he flies away. But Psyche's parents learn of Venus's prophecy that Psyche would marry a monster, and so they take her to a high mountain where Zephyr, the west wind, lifts her up and carries her off to a beautiful castle. And at night, when all the lights are out, a monster comes into her room. Now, she convinces the monster to let her sisters visit, and they are jealous of the beautiful castle that their sister Psyche lives in. They convince her that the creature who comes into her room is actually the monster she is destined to marry. And they convince her to take a light and a dagger and to go and kill the monster while he sleeps. But when she lifts the candle to the monster, she sees that in fact it is Cupid. And he is so handsome that she falls in love with him. And she leans over, and a drop of tallow from her candle falls onto his skin. And in his anger, he flies away. And the sisters, they come back hoping that now they could have Cupid as their husband. And they go to the mountain where they had first abandoned Psyche, and believing that the wind, Zephyr, would take them off to the castle, they leap off of the mountain. But Zephyr, the west wind, knows their evil intentions and never comes. And the sisters, they fall to the rocks below. But Psyche keeps searching for her Cupid. And to find him, she undergoes 3 tests from the jealous Venus. Venus tells her, "You must separate all the tiny grains of wheat from the tiny grains of millet, and those from the tiny grains of barley, and those from the other tiny grains in this enormous storehouse by the end of the day." Well, it's impossible. But Cupid sends tiny ants to come up from the ground and to separate the grains for her. Venus says, "No fair. You had help. Your second task, you gather the golden fleece from the backs of that herd of sheep by the river." But when Psyche came to the rams, she is warned by the river god that when the sun is shining, the rams hate humans and they will kill her unless she waits until the hot noonday sun makes the sheep seek shade. And so she waits until the rams go off into the shade, and she gets the golden fleeces and takes them to Venus. And Venus again says, "No fair. You had help. Go to the world of the dead, to the beautiful queen of the underworld, Proserpine, and bring some of Proserpine's beauty in this box." And she hands her a box. Well, she's been patient up until now, but now she starts to get mad. How am I supposed to get to the world of the dead? Does she want me to die? But just before she dives over a cliff, stop! Cupid's voice tells her what to do. And so she goes to a cave, and that cave leads her to the wide river Styx that separates the land of the living from the land of the dead. And with Cupid's advice, she convinces Charon, the ferryman, to ferry her across that river. And with Cupid's advice, she slips past the 3-headed dog, Cerberus, who guards the land of the dead. She reaches Proserpine, who gives her a little bit of her beauty in a box. But she warns Psyche, "Don't open the box." Psyche takes the box. She slips past the dog. She goes on the ferry across the river back to the cave. She's going down the road. She's nearly back. And when she gets almost back, she gets curious. Just one little bit of beauty. And then I'll be worthy to marry a beautiful god like Cupid. And she peeks inside the box. And immediately, a magical sleep comes over her. And Cupid flies down to her. "You just had to look. Once again, you just had to look." He wakes her up with one of his arrows. And then they go to Jupiter, the king of the gods. They go up to Mount Olympus where all the gods live. And the gods give Psyche ambrosia, the food of the gods. And Psyche becomes immortal. And at last, as equals, Cupid and Psyche can be together. This story may remind you of other mythological stories. The story of Pandora's box, "Don't open the box," or Psyche's curiosity being her Achilles' heel, which is another Greek myth. Greek myths often weren't about trying to find a happy ending. They were about mortals being tossed about by the whim of the gods. The beauty of this story is that Psyche defies the gods and becomes an immortal. She becomes a goddess in the end. Her bravery, spurred by her love, drives her to face her fears and going to Hades and back again for the person she loves. And in all of these stories, East of the Sun, Beauty and the Beast, Beauty's Stone Sisters, and the Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche, it's not only the beast who transforms, it's the heroine herself. She becomes a queen and an immortal. These are all images and metaphors for what we ourselves become when we face our fears. A part of us transforms. When we do brave things, we not only have the potential to change the world around us, a part of us becomes something new too. Our next lecture is about a boy who transforms into all different kinds of creatures. A bird, a horse, a grain of wheat. But the best part of the story is what he finally transforms into in the end.